In the vast expanse of cyberspace where millions of lives intertwine daily, Richard Benson found something he never expected: hope. As the CEO of multiple companies spanning real estate, tech, and luxury goods, Richard had long learned that the world revered him for his power and wealth, but not for his heart. Business partners fawned over him, women threw themselves at him, and the media painted him as the modern Midas who turned everything he touched to gold. But behind the glossy magazine covers and polished boardrooms was a man who, at night, returned to penthouses that echoed with silence. It was during one of these lonely nights, after a grueling 14-hour flight to Shanghai, that Richard, scrolling through Facebook to numb his insomnia, stumbled upon a profile that made him pause. Her name was Jane. Her profile was simple: a soft smile on her display picture, quotes about kindness in her posts, and a timeline that spoke more about hope and perseverance than vanity. Unlike the endless streams of social media influencers he normally encountered, Jane's page felt untouched by greed. Intrigued, Richard sent a friend request, half expecting it to be ignored. To his pleasant surprise, she accepted within minutes. Their chats began innocently, with simple exchanges about favorite books and movies. Richard, careful to maintain his anonymity, kept his identity vague, merely telling her that he was a businessman who traveled often. Jane, on the other hand, spoke freely about her dreams, her struggles, and her desire to someday build an orphanage for abandoned children. Her warmth felt genuine, refreshing against the calculating conversations Richard had grown used to in his daily life. Night after night, time zones and schedules faded into irrelevance as Richard found himself eagerly awaiting her messages. They laughed about silly things, memes, jokes about bad coffee, and embarrassing moments from childhood. He could feel her heart through her words, and for the first time in years, he felt seen, not as a billionaire, but as a man. They never video called, Jane citing poor internet connection as the reason, and Richard, cautious, didn't press her. He didn't need to see her face to believe in what he felt. In an age obsessed with appearances, Richard found it strangely romantic that he was falling in love without ever seeing her live. It was pure. Or so he thought. As weeks turned into months, Richard's emotions grew deeper, tethering him to a woman he had never touched. His business trips became more grueling because he now had something to miss, a connection that wasn't based on profits or influence. In the late hours of his overseas nights, while city lights flickered beyond his penthouse windows, he would read her messages and feel warmth seep into his otherwise cold world. He imagined a future, one where he could build more than empires. He could build a life with someone who loved him for him, not his money. His mind painted vivid pictures: a cozy home where laughter replaced corporate meetings, dinners without bodyguards, holidays spent not negotiating contracts but simply being together. It sounded almost childish, a fairy tale he had locked away long ago when he first tasted wealth and betrayal. But Jane had reopened that door effortlessly, with nothing more than her sincerity. Richard started planning something extraordinary, a surprise that would bind their souls even deeper. He wanted to give her a glimpse of the life they could have together. He would give her a home, a mansion. And through that grand gesture, he hoped to take the first step toward the life he craved. Still, even amid his romantic dreams, Richard's instincts, honed through years of business, whispered caution. It wasn't distrust of Jane necessarily, it was distrust of the unknown. His heart warred with his logic. How could he truly know her if she only knew the side of him he chose to reveal? What if her kindness was conditional, surviving only in the absence of wealth? After all, too many had worn the mask of affection until the scent of money entered the room. Richard knew he had to be sure. If he was wrong, the cost would not be measured in dollars, it would be measured in another scar on a heart already battered from too much betrayal. And so, before making his move, Richard concocted a daring, almost foolish plan. A test. A way to glimpse Jane's soul without the glittering distraction of his fortune. A way to find out whether she loved the man or the empire. Little did he know, this decision would not only change his life forever, but would reveal truths more painful and more beautiful than he ever imagined. The more Richard Benson thought about Jane, the more determined he became to do something extraordinary for her, something that would show her the depth of his feelings even before they had ever met in person. For months, their online conversations had been a sanctuary for him, a place where he felt he could lay down the heavy burdens of his titles and wealth and simply be a man in love. And although they hadn't video called, and although there remained that thin veil of mystery between them, he trusted what he felt. Or rather, he wanted to trust it. Deep in his gut, a small voice urged caution, but Richard chose to drown it out with grand romantic visions. After all, hadn't life taught him that love required risks? That sometimes, to build something beautiful, you had to leap first and hope the net would appear later? So he decided that his next gesture would not be a mere box of flowers or chocolates. It would be something bigger, something life-changing. Something that would make Jane feel cherished beyond measure. He decided to buy her a house. Not just any house, a dream home that would be hers alone, a castle where she could feel like the queen of his heart. Richard spent an entire week personally inspecting listings from some of the best real estate firms in the city. His assistant was baffled by the sudden, personal involvement. Normally Richard simply signed off on multi-million-dollar deals without batting an eye, but this was different. He needed the house to be perfect. He toured estates with sprawling gardens, homes with towering ceilings and marble floors, properties with crystal-clear swimming pools and chandeliers that looked like falling stars. Nothing felt good enough. Until one Friday afternoon, tucked away in an exclusive, serene part of town, Richard found it, a mansion that looked as though it had been plucked from the pages of a fairy tale. The house had clean, modern lines without feeling cold, and massive windows that flooded every room with golden light. There were manicured lawns, winding stone pathways, and a backyard garden large enough to lose oneself in. Standing at the center of the grand living room, Richard closed his eyes and imagined Jane here, laughing, living, breathing in the future they could one day share. His heart raced. Without a second thought, he signed the ownership documents. Money was no object, this was about meaning. About laying the first brick in a castle he wanted to build around the woman who had captured his heart across the distance of oceans and pixels. But a home, no matter how magnificent, felt incomplete without mobility, a symbol of freedom and independence. So Richard went a step further. After finalizing the house, he drove to one of the most prestigious car dealerships in the city. Rows upon rows of gleaming vehicles stood under the sun, but he already knew what he wanted before stepping out of his black SUV. A beautiful, elegant car, sleek yet practical, luxurious but not ostentatious, one that would fit Jane's character as he had come to know it through their conversations. After a short consultation with the dealership's top salesperson, he chose a pristine white luxury sedan, a vehicle known for both its grace and power. He customized the interior with soft beige leather, installed a premium sound system, and even had her initials subtly engraved onto a gold key holder. Everything was done with meticulous care. Every choice whispered devotion. Signing the final purchase papers, Richard couldn't help but smile. This wasn't just a gift, it was a symbol. A symbol of trust. A symbol of the future. A symbol of promises made even before a handshake or a kiss. Richard arranged for the house and the car to be handed over to Jane on the same day, but he made sure everything would be done anonymously at first. He wanted it to feel magical, almost divine, like a blessing dropped into her life without warning. No phone calls. No grand speeches. Just keys and documents delivered carefully to her address by professional agents under strict instructions. Standing at the window of his penthouse later that night, the city lights sparkling beneath him like a field of fallen stars, Richard let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The most tangible pieces of his affection were now in motion. Somewhere, Jane would soon receive a home and a car bought for her by a man she had only known through words and dreams. He wondered how she would react, but not tonight. Tonight, he would savor this quiet victory of the heart. He wasn't thinking about tests or doubts or schemes. Not yet. For now, he let himself believe in the purity of what he was doing. For the first time in a long while, Richard Benson allowed himself to feel vulnerable, and he cherished it. The mansion was bought. The car was delivered. Yet Richard Benson found himself unable to sleep. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, staring down at the city's glowing streets but seeing nothing. There was a nagging feeling in his chest, a voice of caution he could no longer ignore. He had given Jane a life most people could only dream of, but the thought that gnawed at him was simple and cruel. Did she love him, or only the life he could offer? Over the years, Richard had seen how quickly affection could be bought and how easily loyalty could be traded for luxury. He wanted to believe Jane was different, but trust had never been a cheap currency in his world. And so, standing under the heavy silence of the night, Richard decided he needed more than faith, he needed certainty. His mind raced as he searched for a way to reveal Jane's true character without the glamour of wealth clouding her responses. A simple conversation wouldn't do it. No, he needed something raw, something real, something that would expose the heart beneath the smile. That was when an idea, wild and dangerous, took root in his mind. The next morning, Richard called Kingsley to his office. As soon as Kingsley walked in, Richard saw the puzzled look on his face. He wasn't used to seeing Richard look so troubled. Without wasting time, Richard poured out everything, his fears, his hopes, and his crazy plan. Kingsley listened intently, occasionally raising an eyebrow but never interrupting. When Richard finished, there was a long pause before Kingsley finally leaned back in his chair and let out a slow, incredulous laugh. "You want me to pretend to be you? And you'll what? Go undercover as a house help?" Kingsley said, his voice filled with disbelief. Richard nodded seriously. Kingsley steadied him, and after a moment, all amusement faded from his face. "You're serious," he murmured. "Dead serious," Richard replied. It wasn't about pride. It wasn't about power. It was about finding a woman who loved the man, not the name. Kingsley sighed and rubbed his temples. "You know this could backfire horribly, right?" Richard only smiled grimly. "If it does, better now than later." His voice was steady, but inside, his heart was already trembling with the weight of the gamble he was about to make. Kingsley finally agreed, though not without making Richard swear multiple times that he would not reveal the truth prematurely, no matter what he saw or felt. The plan was laid out meticulously. Kingsley would continue being Richard Benson online, updating Jane through video calls, maintaining the illusion that he was the wealthy businessman she had been speaking to all along. Meanwhile, Richard would enter Jane's life physically, but in the most humbling position imaginable, a house help. No wealth, no power, no recognition, only tasks, service, and observation. Kingsley would arrange everything, a fabricated resume for John the house help, an agency to legitimize his employment, and a careful script to follow. Jane would be told that the generous CEO she adored wanted her to have some help settling into her new life. Everything would seem like another gesture of love. Richard agreed to keep his head down, do whatever tasks were assigned, and most importantly, watch. Watch how Jane treated someone she believed was beneath her. Watch who she was when no one was watching her. As Kingsley left the office that day, Richard remained seated behind his desk, feeling a strange mix of dread and exhilaration. His life had always been defined by power plays and calculated risks, but never had he bet something so precious, so personal. He wasn't risking a company or a fortune, he was risking his heart. For a brief moment, fear clawed at him. What if Jane was everything he hoped for and he ended up hurting her by doubting her? What if she was not, and he shattered the fragile hope that had sustained him for months? There was no turning back now. The dice were cast. The stage was set. Richard Benson, billionaire, kingmaker, would soon walk into the life of the woman he thought he loved, not as a prince, but as a pauper. Not to impress her, but to see her for who she truly was. And the truth, whatever it would be, would decide everything. The morning of the switch was crisp and clear, a mockery to the storm of emotions raging inside Richard's chest. Standing in front of the mirror, he hardly recognized himself. Gone was the impeccably tailored Armani suit, the Rolex gleaming on his wrist, the designer shoes polished to perfection. In their place were faded jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, and worn sneakers that had seen better days. His hair, usually styled to perfection, was left slightly messy, and he wore no cologne, only the clean, neutral scent of ordinary soap. He looked like any other man, someone easily overlooked in a crowd. That was exactly what he needed. Today, Richard Benson would cease to exist. Today, he would become John, the humble, faceless house help assigned to assist Jane in her brand new mansion. Gripping the duffel bag that contained his modest belongings, he took a deep breath and stepped out the door, leaving behind the life of privilege he had always known. Meanwhile, Kingsley had already begun his part of the plan. The night before, he had scheduled a video call with Jane, posing as Richard Benson. From Richard's office, carefully staged to match the real one, Kingsley charmed her effortlessly, his charisma and easy smiles winning her over. Jane, already dazzled by the gifts that had appeared like magic in her life, was glowing with excitement. She was dressed in a new outfit, her hair done perfectly, her lips painted in soft pink. Kingsley found it almost too easy to keep up the illusion. He told her that to make her life easier, he had arranged for a personal house help to assist with the new house, someone trustworthy and humble. Jane had squealed with delight, clapping her hands. "You think of everything," she gushed. Kingsley smiled warmly, hiding the slight pang of guilt that tugged at his conscience. Richard was betting his entire future on this woman. Kingsley prayed, for his friend's sake, that the gamble would pay off. At precisely noon, Richard arrived at Jane's new home. The mansion looked even grander in person, its white pillars gleaming under the afternoon sun, the gardens immaculate. He rang the bell and waited, his heart pounding painfully in his chest. After a few moments, the door swung open, and Jane appeared. She was just as he had imagined from her pictures, beautiful, vibrant, her eyes sparkling with energy. For a fleeting second, Richard's breath caught in his throat. Then he remembered his role. Bowing slightly, he murmured, "Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm John, the house help Mr. Benson assigned to assist you." Jane's smile faltered just for a split second, barely noticeable, before she widened it again. "Oh, wonderful. Come in," she said brightly, stepping aside. As Richard entered, he felt the magnitude of what he was about to do settle over him like a heavy cloak. He wasn't here to impress. He was here to see. To listen. To learn. And what he would learn, for better or worse, would change everything. Inside the mansion, Jane led him on a quick, almost careless tour. She pointed at rooms without much detail, giving vague instructions about cleaning and maintenance. Her excitement seemed less about the home itself and more about how grand it made her look. Richard watched her closely, noting every flicker of expression, every shift in tone. She was polite enough, but there was an edge to her, a slight impatience, a tendency to speak at him rather than to him. Still, it was early. Richard reminded himself to be fair. First impressions could be misleading. People had layers, and he was determined to see all of them before making any judgments. As he settled into the modest servants' quarters tucked away behind the kitchen, Richard allowed himself one last lingering hope: maybe Jane would prove herself. Maybe the woman he had fallen in love with still existed beyond all the marble, gold, and glitter. But deep down, a knot of anxiety had already begun to tighten inside him. Something about Jane's smile, the way it didn't quite reach her eyes, chilled him more than he cared to admit. The first few days in Jane's mansion passed with an awkward politeness that barely masked the tension beneath. Richard, still adapting to his disguise as John, did everything he could to remain invisible, silently cleaning, organizing, cooking simple meals when asked, and otherwise staying out of the way. Jane, for her part, played the role of a kind lady of the house to perfection, at least when others were watching. But it didn't take long before cracks began to appear. Richard noticed small things first: the dismissive wave of her hand when he brought her a drink, the sharpness in her tone when she thought he was too slow to respond, the way she never once said thank you unless she was on the phone with someone, pretending to be a gracious host. Alone, she was cold, almost indifferent, seeing him as part of the furniture rather than a person. It stung more than he expected. Still, Richard told himself it was too soon to judge. Maybe she was adjusting. Maybe she was overwhelmed. He buried the unease growing in his chest and continued his duties quietly, but the seeds of doubt had been planted. The real tests came when Jane's friends visited. Sharon, her longtime best friend, was the first to stop by. Richard quickly noticed that Sharon's presence brought out two sides of Jane, an overly sweet version, eager to show off the house and car Richard had gifted her, and a subtly condescending one, especially whenever John was within earshot. One afternoon, as Sharon admired a vase in the living room, Jane laughed and said, "Oh, don't mind John. He's a little slow, but at least he's loyal. I guess Mr. Benson really picked the most obedient one." Richard, arranging flowers nearby, felt the words slice into him like knives. Sharon gave Jane a look, a brief, disapproving frown, but said nothing. Richard caught the glance and tucked it away, noting it carefully. Beneath Jane's charm, there was an ugly pride starting to fester. A part of him still resisted believing it fully. Love, once planted, is hard to uproot, even with the sharpest blades of reality. He kept hoping he was wrong. That somehow, kindness would win out if given time. But each passing day made it harder to cling to that hope. When guests visited, mostly Jane's circle of flashy, social-climbing friends, Jane treated John as an invisible being, ordering him to serve drinks, clear dishes, clean floors in front of everyone without so much as a glance of gratitude. Richard, ever patient, did what he was told, his heart growing heavier with each humiliation. There were moments when Jane's voice dripped with disdain, small jabs that weren't cruel enough to be outright abusive but carried an undeniable sting. It wasn't about what she said, it was the way she said it. The sneer behind the smile. The entitlement behind the compliments. Sharon noticed too. She grew quieter during her visits, her smile strained. Once, Richard overheard her murmuring to Jane in the kitchen, "You shouldn't treat him like that. He's a human being, Jane." Jane's response chilled him to the bone, "He's just a house help. He should be grateful he even gets to live here." That night, lying awake in his small servant's room, Richard stared at the ceiling, feeling the first heavy crack splinter the fantasy he had built in his mind. The hardest part wasn't the chores, the insults, or even the loneliness, it was the realization that the woman he had fallen for, the woman he had trusted sight unseen, might never have truly existed. The pain was sharper than any betrayal he had faced in business. He could endure losing millions, he could rebuild empires, but how did you rebuild a heart that had loved a mirage? Still, Richard held on. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was a desperate need to be wrong. Maybe it was the part of him that still loved the image he had created of Jane, the version of her that lived only in messages and memories. He reminded himself that tests required patience. That you couldn't judge a person on a few bad days. But deep inside, a voice was whispering louder now, a voice he could no longer completely ignore. "Be ready for the truth, Richard. Be ready." As the days wore on, Jane's behavior grew bolder, no longer coated in layers of fake civility. Without any guests to impress or Kingsley, posing as Richard, constantly checking in through video chats, Jane began treating John as if he were little more than an irritating insect in her grand new life. Orders were barked, demands were shouted, and tasks were assigned without the faintest hint of politeness. It was a shocking transformation from the sweet, humble girl Richard had fallen for online. Now, in the mansion he had bought for her, she strutted like royalty, with no thought or concern for the man silently cleaning her floors and washing her dishes. It wasn't the work that hurt Richard, it was the disrespect. Every sneer, every rolled eye, every insult carved another wound into his already battered heart. Yet he said nothing. He obeyed, he smiled weakly, he stayed silent. Observing. Learning. There were moments when the mistreatment turned public, and those were the worst. One evening, Jane hosted a small get-together with some of her more superficial friends. Wine flowed freely, laughter filled the massive living room, and music thumped low in the background. Amid the chatter, Jane made a cruel joke at John's expense, laughing loudly about how even beggars have luck sometimes. Her friends laughed too, some uncomfortably, others openly. Richard stood there, holding a tray of snacks, smiling like it didn't bother him, but inside, something cracked. Sharon was there that evening too, and her discomfort was plain on her face. After the laughter died down, Sharon pulled Jane aside. Richard, pretending to tidy up nearby, caught fragments of their conversation. Jane, you're going too far, Sharon hissed. He's a person, not an object. Jane shrugged casually. Oh, please. He's lucky to even breathe the same air as us. Honestly, Sharon, you need to stop acting like Mother Teresa. Richard heard it all. Every word hammered another nail into the coffin of the love he had once clung to so fiercely. The real heartbreak was seeing how Jane's true nature seemed to flourish when she thought no one important was watching. She wasn't just unkind, she was cruel, petty, vindictive, and entitled beyond belief. She would spill water on the floor just to order John to clean it. She would deliberately mess up rooms, then complain about how poorly they were being maintained. And every time Richard complied without protest, she seemed to derive a twisted satisfaction from it. Sharon, bless her, tried to intervene more than once, softly scolding Jane, offering John smiles of encouragement, even helping him clean once or twice when Jane wasn't looking. But it made little difference. Jane brushed off Sharon's concerns with a laugh and a wave of her perfectly manicured hand, as if kindness were an outdated fashion statement. Richard saw it all. Endured it all. And slowly, painfully, he realized that the woman he thought he loved had never existed. She was a beautiful dream, built on hollow foundations, destined to collapse under the weight of reality. Still, Richard stayed. Not because he enjoyed the abuse, but because he needed to see the full picture. He needed to let this charade play out until there were no lingering doubts. Only then could he walk away with his head held high, knowing he had given love every chance to prove itself. Every night, he lay awake in his tiny room, staring at the ceiling, wondering how something that had started with such pure hope had decayed into this bitter mockery. He thought of Jane's words, her laughter, her cruelty, and he realized something profound: love was not proven in gifts or grand gestures. It was proven in the small, everyday moments. In kindness when no one was watching. In respect offered freely. And by that measure, Jane had failed spectacularly. But what Richard didn't know yet was that even as one heart crumbled, another, far purer, far stronger, was quietly preparing to shine. The day it all came crashing down started like any other, sunlight spilling into the grand living room, the faint smell of roses from the garden drifting in through the open windows. Richard, in his role as John, was quietly scrubbing the floors when Jane's shrill voice pierced the calm. "You missed the spot again, John," she barked from the sofa where she lounged with two of her friends, sipping cocktails at noon. Sharon was there too, seated stiffly in an armchair, her eyes following Jane with increasing discomfort. Richard simply nodded and bent lower, cleaning with exaggerated care. But inside, he was a volcano of emotions: anger, heartbreak, disbelief. He had tried, oh how he had tried, to see the good in Jane. To tell himself that maybe stress, or excitement over the new house, or insecurity had made her cruel. But today felt different. Today, Jane wasn't just careless, she was reveling in his humiliation. It gleamed in her laughter, it laced every word she spoke. And for the first time, Richard felt something shift inside him. The slow, aching death of hope. The situation escalated quickly. One of Jane's friends, emboldened by the casual cruelty of the day, accidentally knocked over her glass of wine onto the floor. The red liquid seeped into the cream carpet like blood. Without missing a beat, Jane clapped her hands sharply. "John! Clean it up! Quickly now," she said, laughing as though she were giving orders to a misbehaving dog. Sharon's face flushed red with anger, but she said nothing, yet. Richard, jaw clenched, moved forward and knelt to clean the mess. That's when it happened. Jane, annoyed that he was taking too long, grabbed a bucket of dirty mop water from earlier cleaning and, with an exaggerated flick, poured it directly over Richard's head. A collective gasp filled the room. The lukewarm, grimy water soaked his clothes, his hair, dripping down his face and blinding his eyes. For a second, time froze. The only sound was the clatter of the empty bucket rolling away. Then, laughter, loud, shrieking laughter from Jane and her friends. Sharon, however, shot to her feet, horror etched across her features. "That's enough, Jane. Sharon snapped, her voice shaking with fury. You've gone too far. Jane rolled her eyes dramatically, tossing her golden hair over her shoulder. Oh, come on, Sharon. He's just a house help. Lighten up. Richard stood slowly, the dirty water dripping onto the expensive carpet. His fists were clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. For a terrifying moment, he thought he might actually scream. Instead, he simply bowed his head low. Thank you, ma'am, he said quietly, his voice calm despite the storm raging inside him. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. Jane watched him go without a flicker of regret. Good riddance, she muttered under her breath. Richard didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had seen everything he needed to see. Whatever dream he had of Jane, it was dead, crushed under the weight of her cruelty. And as he stepped into the bright afternoon sun, dripping and humiliated, he felt strangely free. Sharon rushed after him, calling his name, well, the name she thought he had, John. John, wait. He turned, blinking water from his eyes. Sharon looked at him with such raw compassion that it almost undid him. You can't stay there, she said urgently. Please, come with me. I have a small place, not much, but it's safe. You don't deserve that kind of treatment. Richard opened his mouth to refuse, pride and fear battling within him. But when he looked into Sharon's eyes, warm, kind, unwavering, he saw something he hadn't seen in Jane's in a long, long time, genuine humanity. So he nodded. Wordlessly, he followed Sharon down the driveway, away from the mansion, away from the memories, away from the woman he thought he loved. Toward something new. Toward something real. Sharon's apartment was nothing like Jane's sprawling mansion. It was a tiny, modest two-bedroom flat tucked above a bakery on a bustling street corner. The paint on the walls was chipped in places, the furniture mismatched and worn from years of careful use. Yet the moment Richard stepped inside, he felt a warmth that no marble floor or chandelier could replicate. The air smelled faintly of vanilla from the bakery downstairs, and soft sunlight filtered through sheer curtains, casting golden patterns on the carpet. Sharon hurried around, flustered but determined, clearing a space for him on the small couch and offering him a towel. I'm sorry it's not much, she said, biting her lip anxiously. But you're welcome here. Please, stay as long as you need. Richard accepted the towel with a grateful nod, too moved to speak immediately. In a life filled with hollow luxury, he had never realized how rare and precious simple kindness could be. Sharon, treating him not as a servant or a burden but as a guest, quickly set about making him comfortable. She brought out a clean t-shirt and sweatpants from her brother's old belongings, handed him a steaming mug of tea, and even offered him a plate of warm pastries from downstairs. Every small gesture was wrapped in care, every smile sincere. Richard sat silently, watching her flit around the room, and felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. He had spent millions impressing clients who barely looked him in the eye, showered gifts on women who loved his money more than his soul, yet here, in this humble little apartment, he was treated with more respect and dignity than he had ever known. It wasn't grand. It wasn't extravagant. But it was real. And for the first time in months, Richard felt something inside him begin to heal. Days passed, and Richard found himself slipping into a new rhythm. Sharon refused to let him help with chores, insisting he was a guest. She cooked simple, hearty meals, soups, rice dishes, stews that filled the tiny apartment with mouth-watering aromas, and made sure he was always comfortable. When he protested, feeling guilty for imposing, she would just laugh and say, "You've done enough. Now it's your turn to rest." Richard marveled at her generosity. She didn't know who he really was. To her, he was just John, a homeless house help soaked in dirty water and discarded like trash by her former best friend. And yet she treated him like royalty. No expectations. No conditions. No ulterior motives. It humbled him more than any of Jane's mansions ever could. It made him wonder if perhaps he had been looking for love in all the wrong places, all along. Each evening, They would sit together on the small balcony, sipping tea and talking about everything and nothing. Sharon told him stories of her childhood, her dreams of opening a small cafe one day, her belief that kindness could change the world. Richard listened, captivated not just by her words but by the way her eyes shone when she spoke, by the unpretentious grace she carried in every movement. He began to laugh again, real, full-bodied laughter that he hadn't felt in years. And in those moments, as the city buzzed around them and the stars blinked awake in the night sky, Richard felt the cracks in his heart begin to knit together. He didn't know where this road would lead. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't care about plans or futures. He was simply grateful to walk beside someone whose soul was made of light. Living in Sharon's small, humble apartment introduced Richard Benson to a world he had forgotten could exist. In the mansion he had gifted Jane, there was space for dozens but warmth for none. Here, in a two-bedroom flat above a noisy bakery, Richard found a strange and beautiful comfort. Sharon treated him not as an obligation, not as an accessory to show off, but as a human being worthy of care and dignity. She cooked meals, simple but delicious, and made sure he always had a clean shirt and a warm place to sleep. She laughed with him, asked about his day, and listened with genuine interest. It was in the quiet moments, over a shared meal, or during evenings spent on the small balcony sipping tea, that Richard began to feel a tug inside his chest. It was different from the infatuation he had felt for Jane, built on idealized words and digital exchanges. This was grounded, real, and terrifying in its intensity. Without the layers of wealth, without the armor of status, Richard was simply John to her, and she still treated him with kindness. And somewhere between those ordinary moments, Richard realized he was falling in love. It wasn't a thunderbolt or a sudden realization that crashed into him all at once. It crept up on him slowly, quietly, like dawn seeping through heavy curtains. He noticed it first when Sharon laughed, an open, unguarded laugh that filled the room and made the world outside feel irrelevant. He noticed it when she frowned thoughtfully over a crossword puzzle, her brow furrowed in adorable concentration. He noticed it when she scolded him gently for trying to wash his own dishes, waving him away with a disapproving shake of her head. In those tiny moments, Richard felt something he hadn't felt in years, a pull toward another human being not because of what they could offer him, but because of who they were at their core. It terrified him, this vulnerability. He, who had sat across from billionaires and negotiated hostile takeovers without blinking, now found his heart pounding because of a woman who didn't even know his real name. But it also thrilled him in a way nothing else ever had. He began to look for excuses to linger near her, to prolong conversations about nothing in particular, just to hear her voice a little longer. When Sharon smiled at him, he felt like he had won a prize far greater than any business deal he had ever secured. When she yawned after a long shift and curled up on the couch with a blanket, he fought the irrational urge to sit closer, to wrap her up in his arms and shield her from the weariness of the world. Every instinct inside him screamed that this woman, this life, was what he had been searching for all along without even knowing it. Not the marble halls, not the gala dinners, not the magazine covers. Just this, quiet, real, precious. Richard had spent his entire life building walls around himself, and now, in the presence of Sharon's simple goodness, he felt those walls crumbling without resistance. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset bleed across the city skyline from the small balcony, Richard turned to look at her and felt the full weight of his feelings crash over him like a wave. There was no denying it anymore. He wasn't grateful to her merely out of appreciation. He wasn't kind to her out of guilt or obligation. He loved her. Deeply, helplessly, irrevocably. And it wasn't because she knew who he truly was or because she admired his success. She didn't even know his real name. She loved John, the simple house help with nothing but a battered duffel bag to his name. And Richard loved Sharon, the woman with a heart bigger than any mansion he had ever bought, a soul brighter than any diamond he could afford. Sitting beside her, the city humming around them, Richard closed his eyes briefly and allowed himself to whisper a silent promise to his own heart. He would find a way to deserve her love. Somehow, some way. But tonight, he said nothing. Tonight, he simply loved her in silence. The next few days after Richard's private realization were both blissful and torturous. Every second he spent near Sharon intensified the emotions he was trying desperately to keep hidden. When she laughed at one of his terrible jokes, it felt like the sun had risen just for him. When she absent-mindedly brushed a crumb off his shirt, his heart stuttered painfully in his chest. He wanted to tell her the truth, wanted to fall at her feet and confess everything, who he really was, the mansion, the car, the deception. But fear held him back. Fear that she would see his original plan as manipulation. Fear that he would lose the only real connection he had ever known. Yet with every passing day, the weight of his secret grew heavier, and the fire burning inside him for Sharon grew stronger. It was no longer enough to simply live in her orbit. He wanted to build a future with her, to wake up every morning to the sound of her voice, to protect her, cherish her, and be the man she deserved. One evening, after a quiet dinner of rice and vegetable stew, Sharon curled up on the couch, hugging a worn-out pillow to her chest. The simple domesticity of the moment, her bare feet tucked under her, her hair slightly messy from the humid air, hit Richard so hard that he couldn't breathe. He knew then that he couldn't delay anymore. Whatever risks there were, whatever obstacles might come later, he needed to take the leap now. He rose from his seat slowly, his hands trembling slightly. Sharon looked up at him, her brown eyes wide with innocent curiosity. He crossed the small living room in 3 strides and knelt down before her, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure she could hear it. For a moment, he couldn't find his voice. He simply gazed up at her, memorizing every line of her face, the slight freckle near her temple, the tiny scar above her eyebrow, the faint dimples that appeared when she smiled. She was real. She was perfect. She was everything. "Sharon," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I know this must seem sudden. And maybe it is. But every day I've spent with you, it's shown me what matters. Not money. Not houses. Not cars. Not titles. Just this. You. Us. The way you opened your home to a complete stranger. The way you treated me like a person when you thought I had nothing to offer you. I've seen your heart, Sharon. And it's the most beautiful thing I've ever known." His eyes burned as he spoke, but he forced himself to continue. "I don't have a ring. I don't have fancy words. All I have is this simple, desperate truth: I love you. I want to spend my life with you. Will you? Will you marry me?" The room seemed to shrink around them. Time slowed. The soft ticking of the clock on the wall grew deafening. For a terrifying moment, Sharon simply stared at him, unmoving, her face a perfect mask of shock. Tears filled Sharon's eyes, brimming until they spilled over her cheeks. She dropped the pillow she had been hugging and reached out with trembling hands, cradling his face between her palms. "John," she whispered, using the only name she knew for him, "you don't have to have anything. You are enough. You've always been enough." She smiled through her tears, a smile so radiant that it lit up the tiny apartment more brightly than any chandelier ever could. "Yes. Yes, I'll marry you," she said, laughing and crying at once. Richard let out a ragged breath and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, feeling the warmth of her body against his. In that moment, he didn't care about the lies, the fears, the obstacles still ahead. All that mattered was that she had chosen him, not Richard Benson, billionaire, but John, the humble man she had loved without ever knowing his fortune. As they sat there, tangled together on the worn-out couch, Richard silently vowed that no matter what storms the future might bring, he would spend the rest of his life proving that her faith in him had not been misplaced. The news of John's proposal to Sharon spread quickly, whispered from one friend to another until it reached Jane's perfectly manicured ears one afternoon. She was at a high-end cafe, sipping an overpriced mocha latte, surrounded by 2 of her closest gossip-loving companions when her phone buzzed with a message. The words were simple: "Sharon and John are engaged," but their impact was profound. Jane stared at the screen, blinking slowly as if she hadn't read it right. For a brief, fleeting moment, a flicker of confusion crossed her face. Then, a sharp, scornful smile curled her lips. She tossed her phone onto the table with a dramatic sigh, attracting the curious eyes of her friends. "You will not believe the joke I just heard," she said loudly, ensuring half the cafe could hear her. "Sharon, the charity case, and that filthy houseboy she picked up from the gutter are getting married." Laughter erupted from the table, shrill and mean-spirited, feeding Jane's growing sense of superiority. She basked in their attention, letting the mockery coat her wounded pride like cheap perfume. To Jane, the idea of Sharon and John finding love was not just ridiculous, it was insulting. How dare they pretend to have something real when she, Jane, had sacrificed so much to climb to where she was? In her mind, she was the prize. She was the woman destined for luxury, fame, and adoration. Sharon was supposed to trail behind her, admiring from a distance, forever second best. And John, well, he was supposed to remain invisible, serving the privileged like herself without daring to aspire for anything more. The thought that he, a lowly house help, would not only escape her disdain but also find happiness with someone she once deemed lesser, burned like acid in her veins. "Honestly," Jane continued, twirling a gold bracelet around her wrist, "it's almost sweet, in a pathetic sort of way. Two beggars thinking they've found a kingdom." Her friends laughed harder, encouraging her to invent crueler, more vivid descriptions of John's supposed incompetence and Sharon's desperation. Jane obliged gladly, her words growing sharper, meaner, as though each insult could erase the gnawing bitterness inside her. As the afternoon wore on, Jane's mockery grew into a full-blown performance. She painted vivid, humiliating pictures of Sharon and John's future, a cramped apartment smelling of burnt rice, second-hand clothes, and unpaid bills stacking high. "Maybe," she said with a snicker, "Sharon will get a job cleaning floors right next to her husband. What a power couple they'll be." Every joke was met with shrieks of laughter from the table, and even nearby patrons smirked behind their cups. Jane reveled in it. For a few shining hours, she was back on her throne, admired, envied, adored. It didn't matter that her so-called fiancé hadn't been seen publicly yet. It didn't matter that she had built her current image on lies. What mattered was that she could still crush someone else's happiness under the stiletto heel of her ridicule. In Jane's mind, this mockery wasn't cruelty, it was justice. It was the natural order of things reasserting itself. She was the queen. Sharon was the servant. John was the dust beneath her feet. And this delusion, more than anything else, kept her from seeing just how close her own downfall truly was. Later that evening, alone in her massive, echoing house, Jane replayed the gossip in her mind like a victory song. She poured herself a glass of expensive wine, still laughing occasionally at her own jokes. She posted a few cryptic statuses on social media. Not all love stories are built to last. Some are built to amuse, and sat back to watch the likes and laughing emojis roll in. She imagined Sharon seeing them, feeling humiliated, shrinking back into her tiny, insignificant life. The thought pleased Jane immensely. Yet beneath the smug satisfaction, a tiny, gnawing emptiness stirred. She ignored it, pouring another glass of wine. She didn't know that while she celebrated her cruelty, the seeds of her own ruin were already taking root. She didn't know that the house she stood so proudly in would soon no longer be hers. For now, in her blindness, she saw herself as victorious. Untouchable. The queen reigning high above the peasants. And it was that arrogance, unchecked and unchallenged, that would make the eventual fall not just painful, but utterly devastating. After days of mocking Sharon and John with cruel jokes, Jane decided it wasn't enough. Somewhere inside her, a restless hunger gnawed, a desire not just to mock quietly but to humiliate them publicly, to parade her supposed superiority before them and the world. It wasn't enough to laugh about them behind closed doors. Jane wanted an audience. She wanted witnesses. And so, the idea of a grand party took root in her mind like a poisonous flower. She would host a lavish event at the mansion Richard Benson had bought her, still ignorant of the true story behind her gifts, and invite everyone who mattered. She would make sure Sharon and John stood in the corner, invisible and humiliated, while she stood beside her wealthy fiancé, basking in the envy and admiration of the crowd. Jane convinced herself that this spectacle would erase the sting of hearing about their engagement. It would prove, once and for all, that she was the true winner in the silent competition she believed existed between them. Fueled by wounded pride and vanity, Jane spared no expense in her preparations, sending out gold-embossed invitations, hiring the best caterers, and commissioning a designer gown that shimmered like 1,000 stars. As the party plans unfolded, Jane couldn't resist reaching out to Sharon personally. She crafted a fake invitation dripping with false kindness, delivered it in a velvet envelope sealed with a wax crest. When Sharon opened it, her hands trembled slightly. She read the flowery words, the exaggerated language about celebrating new beginnings and a gathering of friends to mark joyous unions. Sharon knew immediately what it was, a trap. A carefully constructed stage designed to embarrass her. She could see Jane's fingerprints all over it, the mocking undertones, the veiled insults wrapped in lace and gold. Yet when Sharon showed the invitation to Richard, he only smiled, a calm, mysterious smile that Sharon didn't quite understand. "Let's go," he said softly. "Trust me." Sharon hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to decline, to avoid walking into Jane's lion's den. But Richard's eyes, so steady, so filled with the confidence she had come to lean on, calmed her fears. She agreed, though a knot of unease twisted in her stomach as the date approached. Meanwhile, Richard was carefully moving the final pieces into place. He met with Kingsley privately, outlining every detail of what would happen at the party. Kingsley, ever the loyal friend, agreed without hesitation. He would play his role to perfection, and at the perfect moment, he would shatter the fantasy Jane had built so arrogantly around herself. Richard didn't want revenge for the sake of cruelty. He wanted truth to be revealed, not just for Jane's sake, but for Sharon's. He wanted the world to see the woman whose heart had shone bright even when surrounded by luxury, and the woman whose greed had blackened her soul despite having every advantage. It wasn't about humiliating Jane. It was about rewarding Sharon's kindness and proving that goodness, real goodness, still had a place in the world. The preparations were almost complete. Richard could feel it. A storm was gathering on the horizon, silent but unstoppable. And when it broke, the world Jane had built on lies would crumble into dust. As the party day drew closer, Jane grew giddier with anticipation. She spent hours rehearsing her grand entrance, practicing her coy smiles in the mirror, imagining the looks of envy on Sharon's face. She didn't notice the small cracks forming in her fantasy. She didn't question why her fiancé had been so distant lately, why the promised public announcements and magazine features hadn't materialized. Jane was too drunk on her own delusions to see the signs. She ordered floral arrangements tall enough to reach the chandeliers, fountains of champagne that would sparkle under the lights, and a custom soundtrack to accompany her entrance. In her mind, this would be the night she cemented her reign, the night she stood triumphantly above everyone who had dared to doubt her. She didn't know that it would, in fact, be the night her world collapsed before hundreds of witnesses, and that the man she believed she had conquered would be the architect of her undoing. The day of the party dawned bright and unbearably hot, as if the universe itself had decided to spotlight every grand flaw hiding beneath Jane's polished facade. The mansion was a scene of frenzied activity, caterers rushing through hallways, decorators adding final touches to the floral arrangements, musicians setting up near the grand staircase. Everything was over the top, dripping in excess and glittering vanity. Jane stood at the center of it all, a vision of fabricated perfection in a gold-sequined gown that clung to her like a second skin. Her hair was piled high in an elaborate bun, her makeup painted on so expertly that it masked the growing unease in her heart. Yet she dismissed the unease the way she dismissed everything inconvenient, with arrogance. To her, tonight was a coronation. Tonight, she would prove to everyone, and most importantly to Sharon, that she had won. She swept through the mansion issuing orders, barking at staff when things weren't to her exact specifications, utterly oblivious to how her empire was built on sand. Richard and Sharon arrived just as the first wave of guests began pouring into the glittering ballroom. Sharon wore a simple, elegant emerald dress that hugged her curves modestly, her hair cascading down her back in soft waves. Richard, still dressed plainly as John, held her hand as they walked in. They drew curious glances, some mocking, some pitying, but Sharon held her head high. She felt every stare like a needle against her skin but refused to let it pierce her dignity. Richard squeezed her hand gently, his silent support grounding her. They slipped into the background, unnoticed by most, just two humble figures in a sea of ostentation. Jane spotted them almost immediately. Her laughter, already loud, grew shriller. She whispered something to a cluster of guests, all of whom turned to look at Sharon and John with poorly concealed smirks. Jane sauntered toward them with exaggerated grace, a glass of champagne in one hand and venom in her eyes. "Sharon," Jane purred, her smile razor-sharp. "You made it." "How?" "Quaint." She looked Richard up and down with open disdain. "And you brought your little project too." "How adorable." Sharon clenched her jaw, her fingers tightening around Richard's hand, but she said nothing. Richard smiled politely, feeling an odd sense of calm wash over him. He could see it now with perfect clarity, the woman Jane had become. No, not become. The woman she had always been. Only now, there was no veil, no mask. Just raw, naked cruelty hiding behind glitter and gold. "Congratulations on your engagement," Jane added with a smirk, lifting her glass in mock salute. "I'm sure you'll be very happy. In whatever little apartment you end up in." Sharon said nothing. She didn't have to. Her silence was louder than any words. Richard watched Jane gloat, watched her revel in what she thought was victory, and felt not anger, but pity. She didn't know that tonight wasn't her coronation. It was her funeral. And the truth, patient and sharp, was already waiting in the wings. The evening unfolded like a carefully choreographed play. Guests milled about, drinking champagne, nibbling on gourmet hors d'oeuvres, admiring the opulence. Jane was everywhere, basking in compliments, flirting shamelessly with Kingsley, still posing as her elusive billionaire fiancé. She paraded him around like a trophy, tossing glances at Sharon and Richard whenever she could, as if daring them to challenge her new position. Sharon stayed close to Richard, trying to smile, trying to endure the long, humiliating evening with grace. But inside, she was wilting under the pressure. She didn't know what Richard had planned. She didn't know if there even was a plan. All she knew was that every mocking whisper, every sneering glance, was a fresh wound. Still, she stayed. She endured. Because somewhere deep inside, she believed that kindness, real kindness, always had the last word. She just didn't know how close that word was to being spoken. The day of the much-anticipated party finally arrived, ushered in by a morning sky that stretched wide and cloudless, as if nature herself had paused in expectation of what was to unfold. The sunlight poured through the city like golden silk, illuminating every building, every tree, every face turned upward in wonder. It was a beautiful day, too beautiful, perhaps, for the kind of reckoning that loomed unseen beneath the surface. In Jane's mansion, preparations had reached a fever pitch. Staff scurried in every direction, double-checking decorations, adjusting flower arrangements, polishing the marble floors until they gleamed like mirrors. The scent of fresh roses and lavender filled the air, blending with the rich aromas of gourmet dishes being prepped in the kitchen. Jane oversaw every detail with military precision, her nerves stretched taut beneath her glittering exterior. She wore a silk robe embroidered with her initials, her hair wrapped carefully to maintain its style for later. Every moment ticked by with agonizing slowness, yet every breath she took was heavy with triumph. This was the day she had dreamed of, the day she would claim her rightful place in the social hierarchy, elevated high above the likes of Sharon and her pitiful house-help fiancé. Elsewhere across the city, Richard and Sharon moved through their morning with far less fanfare but far more meaning. In the modest little apartment above the bakery, Sharon awoke to find Richard already dressed, standing by the window with a thoughtful expression on his face. He didn't look nervous, he looked peaceful, as though he had been waiting for this day for far longer than Jane could ever imagine. Sharon, on the other hand, struggled with a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. She knew Jane too well, knew that this invitation wasn't extended in goodwill but as a stage for some cruel theater. Yet when she met Richard's calm gaze, the anxiety lessened. There was something reassuring about the way he carried himself that morning, something unshakable. They spoke little as they moved through their preparations, as though words might shatter the fragile stillness surrounding them. Sharon chose a simple but elegant dress, pale blue like a clear summer sky, while Richard donned a plain dark suit. They were not going to compete with Jane's opulence. They were going to walk into the storm with nothing but their truth and their love. As afternoon rolled into evening, the city seemed to hold its breath. In the grand mansion, final touches were applied. The crystal chandeliers were lit, scattering rainbows of light across the marble. Tables groaned under the weight of golden cutlery and the finest china. Waiters stood at attention in black and white uniforms, their faces carefully blank. The guest list was star-studded with socialites, minor celebrities, and the city's elite, all drawn by the tantalizing rumors swirling about Jane's mysterious, wealthy fiancé. Jane spent the final hours before the party in her dressing room, surrounded by stylists and assistants who fluttered around her like nervous butterflies. She sat before a vanity mirror, watching her reflection with a hungry gleam in her eyes. Tonight was supposed to be her coronation. Tonight, she would ascend above everyone who had ever doubted her, who had ever dared to pity her. She applied a final coat of lipstick with shaking hands, mistaking the tremor for excitement rather than the first tremors of a coming collapse. As the clock neared the appointed hour, cars began arriving at the mansion's grand circular driveway. Valets opened doors with mechanical precision, ushering in guests who glittered with jewels and designer gowns. Jane floated through the entrance hall, greeting arrivals with a radiant smile that barely concealed her frantic anticipation. She scanned each new face eagerly, searching for Sharon and John, aching to see the shock and inferiority etched across their features. Upstairs, hidden from view, Kingsley waited, adjusting his cufflinks with the calm of a man who knew his part by heart. Richard and Sharon, meanwhile, were already on their way, their hands entwined tightly in the back seat of a modest taxi, a silent bond linking them against the coming storm. The stage was set. The players were ready. The lights were about to come up. But for now, the world held its breath, standing at the brink of a night that would be remembered not for its splendor, but for its spectacular undoing of pride and pretense. The grand ballroom shimmered with a golden glow as hundreds of elegantly dressed guests milled about, their laughter and chatter echoing off the marble walls. Underneath the glittering chandeliers and the heavy velvet drapes, excitement buzzed in the air like electricity before a storm. Jane stood at the center of it all, the proud architect of this lavish spectacle. Her golden gown clung to her curves like a second skin, and every time she moved, the sequins caught the light, making her look like a living flame. She could feel the attention, the admiration, the envy soaking into her skin, and she basked in it. Tonight was the night she would prove that she was not just another pretty face or social climber. She would show everyone, including Sharon, that she had ascended to a world they could only dream of. At her side, Kingsley smiled charmingly, playing his role as the devoted fiancé to perfection. To Jane, the evening already felt like a victory parade. She had no idea how dangerously close she stood to the edge of her own undoing. As the clock struck the planned hour, Jane clinked her champagne glass against a silver spoon, commanding the room's attention with effortless confidence. The conversations died down. The music faded into a soft instrumental hum. All eyes turned toward her, and she relished the moment. She lifted the microphone handed to her by a waiting staff member and beamed at the audience, her voice bright and honeyed. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her tone dripping with satisfaction. "Thank you all for coming to share this special night with us, a night celebrating love, success, and new beginnings." Applause erupted politely. Jane turned to Kingsley with a wide, adoring smile. "Now," she continued, her voice almost trembling with rehearsed emotion, "I would like to invite the love of my life, my extraordinary fiancé, Mr. Richard Benson, to say a few words." She handed the microphone to Kingsley with a flourish and stepped back, clutching her hands to her chest theatrically, ready to soak up every ounce of admiration that would surely follow. Kingsley accepted the microphone with a charming smile, his posture relaxed but commanding. The guests leaned forward, sensing something important was about to be shared. He cleared his throat gently, allowing the suspense to build just a little more before speaking. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began warmly, his voice carrying easily across the vast ballroom. "Tonight is truly special, not just for Jane and myself, but for all of you who have come to witness the beginning of something truly magnificent." He paused, glancing at Jane, who beamed back at him with unmasked pride. "Jane," he said, his voice rich and affectionate, "is one of the most ambitious, beautiful, and determined women I have ever met. Her drive, her passion, her heart, they are unmatched." Applause broke out again, louder this time, with several of Jane's friends clapping enthusiastically. Jane pressed a hand to her chest, feigning modesty but practically glowing with satisfaction. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. The validation she had craved. In her mind, the crown had already been placed firmly on her head. Kingsley let the applause fade naturally before speaking again. His voice dropped slightly, gaining a heavier, more serious tone. "But before we continue," he said, his words slicing through the atmosphere like a knife, "I have an important announcement to make." The room froze. The gentle hum of music faded to near silence. Every head turned toward the stage, every eye trained on Kingsley. Jane's smile faltered slightly, a flicker of confusion crossing her features. Richard, standing quietly beside Sharon near the back of the room, watched with calm, steady eyes. Sharon's hand tightened instinctively around Richard's, sensing the shift even though she didn't yet understand it. A ripple of unease skated through the guests, whispers rising and falling like restless waves. "What announcement?" Jane frowned, her heart beginning to pound a little faster, her fingers trembling just slightly at her sides. Kingsley looked over the sea of expectant faces, his smile lingering but touched now with something sharper, something far more dangerous. And as he opened his mouth to speak again, the chapter closed, not with words, but with a silence so heavy it smothered the room like a suffocating fog. The heavy silence that hung over the ballroom was almost unbearable. The guests shifted uncomfortably, their polished shoes scuffing softly against the marble floor as they leaned in, eager and terrified to hear what Kingsley would say next. Jane stood frozen beside him, the triumphant glow she had worn earlier now dimming, replaced by a creeping, uneasy fear. She forced a bright smile onto her face, willing herself to believe that Kingsley was about to announce something wonderful, an engagement date, perhaps, or an even grander declaration of love. But deep down, something cold and slippery twisted in her gut. Kingsley's posture had changed. He no longer stood like a doting fiancé. He stood like a man about to pass judgment. Slowly, deliberately, he raised the microphone to his lips again and spoke in a voice that was steady, clear, and merciless. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his words slicing through the tension like a scalpel, "I am not Richard Benson." A gasp swept through the crowd, a collective inhalation of shock so loud it echoed off the gilded walls. Heads whipped back and forth as guests tried to make sense of what they had just heard. Cameras flashed as bloggers and reporters scrambled to capture the unfolding drama. Jane staggered a step backward, her perfectly manicured hand flying to her chest as if trying to physically hold her crumbling world together. "What? What are you talking about?" she stammered, her voice unnaturally high-pitched. She laughed nervously, throwing a desperate glance at the audience. "He's joking, of course. Just a little surprise for the party, right, darling?" Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. But Kingsley wasn't smiling. He turned his head slowly toward Jane, his gaze cold, almost pitying. "No, Jane," he said, his voice soft but lethal. "I am not the man you thought you were engaged to. I never was." The murmurs grew louder now, confusion spreading like wildfire among the glittering crowd. Some guests pulled out their phones, recording the spectacle unfolding before their eyes. Others whispered furiously behind gloved hands, their eyes darting between Jane and Kingsley, and then scanning the room, looking for the real Richard Benson. Jane's mind raced frantically, trying to find a way to salvage the situation. Maybe if she laughed it off hard enough. Maybe if she played the victim. Maybe if she cried. But no matter which path she considered, each ended at the same wall, the realization that the man she had flaunted, the man she had leaned on for her grand ascension, had never truly belonged to her. She turned pleading eyes to Kingsley, but he had already shifted his focus away from her. His arm extended once again, pointing out into the sea of faces. "The real Richard Benson," he said, his voice echoing across the stunned crowd, "is standing among you right now. Not dressed in gold. Not parading himself as royalty. But standing humbly, patiently. Watching." Every head turned, every eye searching frantically across the room. And then, like the slow parting of clouds to reveal the sun, the crowd's attention converged on one figure, Richard Benson, standing at the back of the hall, his dark suit simple but his posture commanding. He held Sharon's hand tightly, protectively, a quiet strength radiating from him that needed no announcement, no fanfare. As realization dawned, gasps and exclamations filled the air. Guests who had mocked him, who had overlooked him, now stared in stunned disbelief. Richard took a slow, measured breath, releasing Sharon's hand gently. His face was calm, almost serene, as he began making his way through the crowd. Every step he took sent shockwaves through the gathering. Every eye was locked on him, wide with wonder, fear, regret. And Jane, poor, proud Jane, could only watch, paralyzed, as the true king, the true architect of her dreams and nightmares, walked steadily toward the stage, bringing with him the reckoning she never saw coming. For a brief, desperate moment, Jane tried to cling to the only weapon she had left, denial. As Richard ascended the steps to the stage, calm and commanding in his simple dark suit, she forced a laugh, sharp, brittle, and far too loud in the suffocating silence. The sound cracked unnaturally through the room, drawing startled glances. "Oh, come on," she said, her voice trembling despite her efforts to sound light. "You're kidding, right? This is all just a silly party prank. Right, darling?" Her manic eyes swung wildly between Kingsley and Richard, seeking any hint of reassurance, any silent confirmation that she wasn't standing on the brink of ruin. But there was none. Kingsley had stepped aside, his role in the revelation complete. And Richard simply stood there, his eyes cold, impenetrable, seeing through every mask she tried to wear. Jane's laugh faltered, the corners of her mouth twitching as the dreadful truth clawed its way into her chest. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their earlier admiration for Jane evaporating like mist under the rising sun of reality. Richard stepped forward, his hand steady as he reached for the microphone. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. His very calmness made the moment all the more terrifying for Jane. Holding the microphone loosely in one hand, he turned his gaze onto her, and when he spoke, his voice was low, even, but laced with a steel that brooked no argument. "Jane," he said, the single syllable heavy with finality, "everything you thought you earned through flattery and greed. You earned nothing." His words, though quietly spoken, reverberated through the hall, magnified by the sheer stillness of the crowd. He turned to address the audience now, his face composed. "The house. The car. The gifts. Every single thing you bragged about tonight was given under false pretenses. Not to reward arrogance. Not to build a throne for pride. They were meant as acts of love. Given to the woman I thought you were." His words sliced cleanly, and Jane flinched as if physically struck. Another brittle laugh escaped her lips, weaker this time, desperate. "Richard, please," she whispered, her voice trembling, "don't embarrass me. Let's talk about this. Privately." But Richard was beyond the reach of her pleading now. He continued as if she hadn't spoken. "Effective immediately," he said, his voice slicing through the heavy air, "the house is no longer yours. The car will be collected by my staff within the hour. Any remaining gifts or accounts linked to my name have been revoked." He paused, letting the finality of his words settle like dust over a ruined battlefield. Jane's knees buckled slightly, and she reached out instinctively toward Kingsley, but he had already stepped away, his role finished. Alone, truly alone for perhaps the first time in her life, Jane swayed on her heels, her vision blurring. The glittering ballroom, the applause she had craved, the respect she had demanded, all of it slipped through her grasp like water through trembling fingers. A harsh whisper rose among the guests, people turning away, their faces filled with pity, with judgment, with cruel satisfaction. Jane stumbled forward, hands outstretched as if trying to grab onto the last shreds of her crumbling dream, but there was nothing left to hold. Jane collapsed to her knees, the golden fabric of her dress pooling around her like the remnants of a fallen empire. Tears, hot and heavy, blurred her vision as she looked up at Richard, who simply stood there, silent, immovable, untouchable. She wanted to scream, to rage, to claw back the life she had lost in the span of a few sentences. But what weapon did she have left? Lies had brought her here, and no lies could save her now. The room seemed to spin around her, filled with whispering shadows and judgmental stares. She opened her mouth to beg but found that the words stuck in her throat, choked by the crushing weight of her humiliation. The mighty Jane, who once ruled this glittering world with a smile and a sneer, was now nothing more than a fallen queen, stripped of her crown and left weeping on a marble floor. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the humiliation and rage, a tiny voice, one she had ignored for far too long, whispered the brutal, unforgiving truth: you did this to yourself. The collapse, when it finally came, was not a graceful surrender, it was raw, desperate, and humiliating. Jane, still on her knees, reached out with trembling hands toward Richard, the man she had once believed she could manipulate so easily. Her golden gown was wrinkled and dirty from the marble floor, but she no longer cared about appearances. Pride, dignity, image, these things had abandoned her just as swiftly as her fabricated wealth had. Please, she sobbed, her voice cracking painfully in the vast, echoing silence of the ballroom. Richard, please. I didn't know. I didn't mean it. Her tears streamed freely now, smudging the perfect makeup she had spent hours applying. The guests, previously enchanted by her, now looked away, some with pity, others with smug satisfaction. Jane clutched at the hem of Richard's jacket, her fingers twisting the fabric desperately as if clinging to the last lifeline she would ever have. Richard looked down at her with an expression that was not cruel, but distant, like a judge delivering a verdict to a defendant whose fate had long been sealed. He did not pull away immediately. He allowed her to clutch him for a moment longer, allowed her the small mercy of thinking, briefly, that her words might still hold power over him. Then, gently but firmly, he stepped back, letting her hands fall uselessly into her lap. Jane, he said, his voice low and without malice, you didn't love me. You loved what you thought I could give you. His words were not shouted, not harsh, but they rang louder than any scream. Jane shook her head violently, her hair falling loose around her shoulders. No. No, that's not true. I was stressed. I didn't know it was you, I swear. If I had known. She trailed off, realizing too late how hollow her protest sounded. If she had known he was a billionaire, she would have treated him better. Not because she loved him, but because she feared losing his wealth. The naked truth of it lay exposed between them, ugly and undeniable. The weight of the moment crushed Jane further, pressing her down until she could barely breathe. Give me another chance, she whimpered, her voice barely more than a broken whisper. I'll be better. I'll change. I was just scared. Misunderstood. Please, Richard. Her hand scraped along the marble floor as she tried to pull herself closer to him again, like a drowning woman reaching for a lifeboat that had already begun to drift away. But Richard did not move toward her. He did not offer his hand. He did not soften. Instead, he simply looked at her with a sorrowful finality, a man who had once offered his heart and had seen it trampled without a second thought. You showed me who you were when you thought I had nothing, he said, his voice steady. I don't need to see anything else. And with those simple words, he turned away, leaving Jane kneeling, abandoned by the very thing she had worshipped most, power. As Richard walked away, the crowd parted before him like a tide, their whispers swelling behind him in a crescendo of scandal and fascination. Jane remained crumpled on the floor, her sobs echoing in the vast hall that had once been her throne room. She had played her games, spun her lies, strutted proudly across a stage she thought she controlled. And now, stripped bare before all who had once envied her, she was nothing more than a cautionary tale, a monument to pride, greed, and the cost of a heartless ambition. Sharon moved forward silently, her soft steps barely making a sound as she rejoined Richard. She spared Jane only a single glance, not of hatred, but of sorrow. There was no triumph in Sharon's heart, no gloating. Only the quiet understanding that goodness, in the end, spoke louder than cruelty ever could. Together, Richard and Sharon walked toward the future, leaving behind the glittering ruins of a world built on lies. And behind them, in the cold silence of her own making, Jane wept alone. The grandeur of the ballroom faded into a hollow shell as the last guests hurried to leave, eager to escape the weight of shame and broken illusions lingering in the air. Jane remained crumpled at the edge of the stage, her sobs a painful soundtrack to the dying echoes of the once proud event. Richard didn't spare her another glance. There was nothing left to say. The chapter was closed. With his hand gently resting on the small of Sharon's back, Richard guided her silently through the dispersing crowd. They didn't need words. Everything had been said with actions: Sharon's unwavering kindness, Richard's trust, Jane's downfall. The heavy doors of the ballroom closed behind them with a soft finality, shutting out the last remnants of betrayal and pretense. Outside, the night was cool and clear, the stars blinking overhead as if the heavens themselves bore witness to the quiet triumph of two hearts that had found each other against all odds. For days after the party, Richard and Sharon stayed away from the public eye, choosing peace over spectacle. Richard withdrew from the lavish circles he had once dominated, content to build a new life rooted in love rather than luxury. The mansion he had once given to Jane was repossessed without fanfare, and the properties linked to his name were quietly reassigned. The media buzzed for a few weeks, but Richard paid them no mind. His attention was solely on Sharon, the woman who had sheltered him, believed in him, loved him when she thought he had nothing. Sharon, for her part, struggled to adjust to the surreal reality that the humble John she had cared for was one of the country's most powerful men. But what never changed was her heart. She loved Richard not for the weight of his name or the expanse of his fortune, but for the tenderness of his touch, the steadiness of his love, and the depth of his soul. Their wedding was not the spectacle some might have expected for a man of Richard's status. It was a small, intimate ceremony held in the garden of a countryside estate Richard had bought for them, nothing too grand, nothing too loud. Just close friends, a handful of family members, and the scent of wild roses filling the air. Sharon wore a simple ivory gown that floated around her like a dream, her hair left down in soft waves. Richard waited for her under an archway draped with white flowers, his heart hammering in his chest as he watched her walk toward him. When Sharon reached him, she smiled, a smile so radiant that it erased every shadow from his past. Their vows were whispered, promises made not to impress, but to endure. When Richard slipped the wedding band onto Sharon's finger, it was a final seal, not just of love, but of gratitude, of redemption, of a second chance neither of them had dared dream possible. That night, after the last guest had gone and the stars blinked overhead in a dark velvet sky, Richard and Sharon stood together on the veranda of their new home, wrapped in each other's arms. No words were needed between them. The battles had been fought, the storms weathered. Now there was only peace, the kind of peace born not from wealth or fame, but from finding the one soul who would hold your hand through every trial. As Sharon rested her head against Richard's chest, he pressed a kiss to her hair and whispered against her ear, "You saved me." Sharon smiled sleepily, her fingers curling against his heart. "We saved each other," she replied. And under the soft chorus of crickets and the hush of the night, Richard finally understood what it meant to be truly rich, not in bank accounts or stock markets, but in the fragile, fierce, beautiful bond he now shared with the woman who had loved him when he had nothing, and who would love him still when he had everything. The months that followed their wedding were some of the happiest of Richard and Sharon's lives. Gone were the heavy burdens of secrets, betrayals, and false identities. In their place blossomed a life filled with laughter, shared meals, whispered conversations under warm quilts, and long walks beneath starlit skies. Richard had shifted much of his business responsibilities to trusted deputies, choosing instead to work from home more often, building a life alongside the woman who had taught him the true meaning of love. The countryside estate they lived in wasn't just a house, it was a sanctuary, a place where every room carried traces of their quiet joy. Richard often found himself marveling at how easily Sharon had filled the vast spaces with warmth, not with expensive furniture or grand decorations, but with small, thoughtful touches, fresh flowers on the dining table, soft music drifting from the kitchen, the scent of fresh-baked bread filling the air. Every day with Sharon felt like a gift he never wanted to stop unwrapping. It wasn't long before life presented them with another unexpected blessing. Sharon discovered she was pregnant one crisp autumn morning, the first frost dusting the fields like powdered sugar. She had suspected it for a few weeks, the way her body had changed, the strange fluttering of emotions, but holding the confirmation in her hand made it real in a way that sent her heart soaring. She waited for Richard to return from a brief trip to the city before telling him, unable to imagine sharing the news with anyone else first. That evening, after a quiet dinner, Sharon took Richard's hand and placed it gently over her belly, her smile trembling with tears. "We're going to have a baby," she whispered, her voice breaking with joy. For a long moment, Richard simply stared at her, as if trying to grasp the magnitude of the moment. Then, with a laugh choked by emotion, he pulled her into his arms and held her so tightly she could hardly breathe. In that instant, all the struggles, all the betrayals, all the loneliness they had endured seemed like distant memories, washed away by the overwhelming promise of a new life they had created together. The pregnancy was a beautiful journey, though not without its challenges. Sharon was fiercely independent, insisting on continuing her small projects around the house and garden despite Richard's constant, hovering concern. He was doting to the point of obsession, reading every book he could find about pregnancy, attending every doctor's appointment, even installing a state-of-the-art nursery long before Sharon insisted it was necessary. They spent countless evenings sitting together, Richard's hand resting on her growing belly, feeling the small, fluttering kicks of the life inside. They debated names for weeks, laughing and dreaming about who their child would become. Through every wave of nausea, every sleepless night, and every flutter of anxiety, their bond deepened, rooted not in perfection but in their unwavering support of one another. Richard often marveled at Sharon's strength, her quiet resilience. He knew that no matter what the future held, with Sharon by his side, he could face anything. When the day finally came, it was a clear spring morning, the air fresh with the scent of blooming flowers. After hours of labor, Sharon gave birth to a beautiful baby girl with a head full of dark curls and a cry so strong it seemed to shake the walls of the hospital room. They named her Isabel, a name that meant devoted to God, a name that carried with it the strength, grace, and hope of everything they had fought so hard to build. As Richard cradled his daughter in his arms for the first time, tears blurred his vision. He looked at Sharon, exhausted, radiant, magnificent, and realized, yet again, how profoundly blessed he was. Isabel was more than just a child, she was the embodiment of a love born in truth, tested by fire, and proven by kindness. That night, as the new family of three lay together, the moonlight bathing them in silver, Richard whispered a silent prayer of gratitude. Not for the wealth he possessed, not for the power he commanded, but for the simple, breathtaking miracle of love that had found him when he least deserved it, and had given him everything he never knew he needed.